The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace courtyard as Captain Marcus Wellington adjusted his red uniform for the final time. After 23 years of service to the Royal Guard, this would be his last ceremonial duty. The brass buttons gleamed against his chest, each one polished to perfection as tradition demanded. His black boots reflected the cobblestones beneath his feet, and his tall bearskin hat sat perfectly positioned on his graying head. Marcus had seen many dignitaries pass through these gates. Presidents, prime ministers, kings, and queens had all walked the same path he now guarded. Each time he had stood at attention with unwavering respect, his right hand moving sharply to his temple in the traditional salute that had been performed for centuries. It was more than just a gesture. It was a symbol of honor, duty, and respect for the office they held. Today was different. Word had spread through the palace that President Donald Trump would be arriving for a state visit. The usual preparations were underway. Red carpets rolled out, security protocols reviewed, and every guard briefed on proper ceremonial procedure. Marcus had participated in these briefings countless times, but today his mind wandered to memories that seemed a lifetime away. He thought about his younger brother James, who had been just 19 when he enlisted in the army. James had always looked up to Marcus, following in his footsteps from childhood games of soldiers to actual military service. The two brothers had served their country with pride, Marcus in the prestigious Royal Guard and James in the infantry. They had written letters to each other regularly, sharing stories of duty, honor, and their hopes for the future. The other guards began taking their positions along the ceremonial route. Marcus watched his colleagues, men and women he had trained, served alongside, and respected. Many of them were young enough to be his children, fresh-faced and eager to serve. They reminded him of James, full of idealism and dedication to something greater than themselves. As the morning progressed, Marcus found himself thinking about a conversation he had with his commanding officer just weeks earlier. "You've been an exemplary soldier, Wellington," the officer had said. "Your record is spotless, your dedication unquestionable. After your retirement, you'll be remembered as one of our finest." But Marcus wasn't thinking about his legacy today. Instead, his mind drifted to a small town in Afghanistan, where his brother James had served his final tour of duty. The details of that day remained vivid in Marcus's memory, even though it had happened several years ago. James had been part of a convoy providing humanitarian aid to local villages when their vehicle hit an improvised explosive device. The investigation that followed revealed troubling details. Intelligence reports had warned of increased militant activity in the area, but the mission had proceeded anyway. James and 3 other soldiers lost their lives that day, while several others were severely injured. The families were told their loved ones died as heroes, serving their country with honor. Marcus remembered receiving the news while on duty at the palace. He had maintained his composure during the ceremony that day, standing guard as a foreign diplomat visited the Queen. Only later, in the privacy of his quarters, had he allowed himself to grieve. The funeral was held with full military honors, and Marcus had folded the flag that covered his brother's casket. In the months that followed, Marcus had tried to understand what had happened. He read every report he could access, spoke with James's fellow soldiers, and tried to piece together the decisions that led to that fateful day. The more he learned, the more questions arose about the leadership and decision-making that had put his brother and so many others in harm's way. The sound of approaching vehicles brought Marcus back to the present. The presidential motorcade would arrive soon, and he needed to be ready. He checked his uniform one final time and took his position along the red carpet. The other guards stood at perfect attention, their faces showing no emotion, their eyes focused straight ahead. Marcus had always taken pride in the discipline required for ceremonial duties. The ability to stand motionless for hours, to maintain perfect posture regardless of weather conditions, and to show proper respect for visiting dignitaries was a skill that took years to master. He had trained countless young guards in these traditions, passing down the knowledge and customs that made the Royal Guard famous throughout the world. As he stood there, Marcus thought about the oath he had taken when he first joined the Guard. He had sworn to serve with honor, to protect and defend, and to uphold the highest standards of military conduct. That oath had guided him through more than 2 decades of service. Through good times and challenging moments, through personal loss and professional triumph. The distant sound of motorcycles announced the approaching arrival. Palace staff made final adjustments to the red carpet, and security personnel took their positions. Marcus could feel his heart beating faster, not from nervousness about the ceremony, but from the weight of the decision he had made. He thought about his wife Sarah, who had supported him throughout his career. She understood the demands of military life, the long hours, and the dedication required. When he had told her about his decision, she had simply nodded and said, "I trust your judgment, Marcus. You've always done what you believed was right." Their children, now adults with families of their own, had grown up respecting their father's service. They had attended countless military ceremonies, understanding from an early age the importance of honor, duty, and service to others. Marcus wondered what they would think of his decision today. The motorcade appeared in the distance, a line of black vehicles moving slowly toward the palace entrance. Marcus could see the flags flying from the lead car, and he knew that in just a few minutes, he would face the moment that would define not just this day, but possibly his entire career. He had made his decision based on principles that ran deeper than protocol or tradition. Sometimes, he believed, true honor required difficult choices that others might not understand. As the vehicles drew closer, Marcus Wellington stood perfectly still, his mind clear and his conscience at peace with what he was about to do. The presidential motorcade came to a smooth halt, directly in front of the palace steps. Marcus watched as security agents stepped out of the lead vehicles, their eyes scanning the area with professional efficiency. The routine was familiar. He had witnessed it dozens of times before with different world leaders. Every detail was choreographed with precision, from the positioning of the vehicles to the timing of each movement. Captain Marcus Wellington maintained his position along the red carpet, standing exactly where protocol demanded. To his left and right, fellow guards stood equally still, their faces showing the neutral expression that years of training had perfected. The morning air was crisp, and Marcus could hear the distant sounds of London traffic beyond the palace walls, a reminder of the normal world continuing outside these ceremonial moments. The passenger door of the main vehicle opened, and President Trump emerged, straightening his suit jacket as he looked up at the imposing palace facade. Marcus had seen photographs and television footage of the American president many times, but seeing him in person was different. The man appeared confident, walking with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. As Trump began walking along the red carpet, approaching the line of guards, Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Each step brought the moment closer, when the president would pass directly in front of him. According to protocol, Marcus should raise his right hand to his temple in a sharp salute, holding the position until the dignitary had passed. It was a gesture he had performed hundreds of times before, so automatic that it required no conscious thought, but today, Marcus found himself thinking about Sergeant Thompson, one of his brother James's closest friends in the Army. Thompson had survived the attack that killed James, though he carried both physical and emotional scars from that day. In their conversations, Thompson had shared details about the decisions made leading up to the mission, the warnings that were ignored, and the policies that put soldiers in unnecessary danger. Marcus remembered Thompson's words. "Your brother questioned the mission, Captain. He knew something wasn't right, but orders were orders. James always followed orders, even when he disagreed with them. That's the kind of soldier he was." Those words had haunted Marcus for months, making him wonder about the balance between following orders and following conscience. President Trump was now just 20 feet away, moving slowly along the red carpet, while palace officials pointed out various architectural features of the building. The president nodded politely, occasionally stopping to shake hands with staff members who had been selected for this honor. His security detail maintained their careful formation around him, alert for any potential threats. Marcus could see other world leaders and dignitaries following behind Trump, including members of his administration and British officials. The Queen herself would greet the presidential party at the main entrance, where photographers and news crews waited to capture the historic moment. This was diplomacy at its most formal level, where every gesture carried significance and every detail would be analyzed by political observers around the world. The weight of his decision pressed down on Marcus like a heavy burden. He thought about his military training, which emphasized obedience, discipline, and respect for authority. These values had shaped his entire adult life, guiding him through challenges and helping him become the respected leader he was today. Breaking with protocol, even for deeply personal reasons, went against everything he had been taught. Yet Marcus also thought about another kind of duty, the obligation to honor the memory of his fallen brother and all the soldiers who had died under questionable circumstances. James had believed in serving something greater than himself, but he had also trusted that his leaders would make wise decisions and value the lives of those under their command. Trump was now just 10 feet away, close enough that Marcus could see the details of his face and hear his conversation with the accompanying officials. The president appeared relaxed, occasionally smiling at something one of his hosts had said. To him, this was probably just another diplomatic event in a busy schedule of meetings and ceremonies. Marcus's right hand remained at his side, contrary to what every instinct and year of training told him to do. He could sense the confusion of his fellow guards who had begun their salutes as protocol demanded. From the corner of his eye, he could see hands moving to temples in the traditional gesture of respect. But Marcus's hand stayed down. The president passed directly in front of Marcus, no more than 3 feet away. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Trump seemed to notice something unusual, perhaps the fact that this particular guard was not saluting, but he continued walking without breaking stride. The moment lasted only a few seconds, but to Marcus it felt like an eternity. Behind the president, other officials noticed the breach of protocol. Marcus could see palace staff members looking in his direction with expressions of concern and confusion. Some pointed discreetly while others whispered among themselves. In all their years of organizing state visits, they had never witnessed a guard refusing to salute a visiting dignitary. Marcus maintained his rigid posture, staring straight ahead as he had been trained to do. His face showed no emotion, though inside he felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. He had made his choice and acted on his convictions, but he also knew there would be consequences. The question was whether those consequences would be worth the statement he had made. As the presidential party moved toward the palace entrance, Marcus could hear increased chatter among the observers. News photographers who had been focusing on the president began turning their cameras toward the guards. Some had clearly noticed the unusual behavior and were trying to capture images of the guard who had not saluted. The ceremony continued as planned, with the Queen appearing at the entrance to greet her guests. The formal pleasantries were exchanged, gifts were presented, and speeches were made about the importance of the special relationship between the two nations. Throughout it all, Marcus remained at his post, knowing that his small act of defiance would not be forgotten. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, Marcus's direct superior, appeared at his side as the official ceremony concluded. "Captain Wellington," he said quietly, "you're needed for an immediate debriefing." His tone was professional but serious, and Marcus knew that the most difficult part of his day was just beginning. As Marcus followed his superior toward the palace offices, he thought one final time about his brother James. He wondered what James would think of his decision, whether he would approve or be disappointed in his older brother's breach of military protocol. But deep in his heart, Marcus believed he had honored James's memory in the only way he knew how. The debriefing room was austere and formal, with portraits of past commanding officers lining the walls. Marcus sat across from Lieutenant Colonel Harrison at a polished wooden table that had witnessed countless disciplinary hearings over the decades. The afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the room as Harrison reviewed the paperwork spread before him. "Captain Wellington," Harrison began, his voice measured and careful, "your service record is exemplary. 23 years without a single disciplinary incident, numerous commendations, and the respect of every soldier under your command. That's why what happened today is so difficult to understand." Marcus remained silent, maintaining the same rigid posture he had displayed during the ceremony. His hands rested flat on the table, and his eyes focused on a point just above Harrison's shoulder. Years of military discipline had taught him when to speak and when to listen, and this was clearly a time for listening. Harrison continued reading from Marcus's file. Joined the Royal Guard in 2001 at age 22. Promoted to sergeant in 2005, staff sergeant in 2008, and captain in 2015. Served with distinction during the London Olympic security detail. Received the Queen's Commendation for Service in 2018. No negative marks, no complaints, no incidents. He looked up from the papers. Until today. The silence in the room was heavy with unspoken questions. Harrison set down the file and leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus's face for any sign of explanation. The press has already started asking questions, he said. Within an hour of the ceremony, we had calls from 3 different news organizations wanting to know about the guard who didn't salute the American president. Marcus knew this would happen. In today's world of instant communication and social media, nothing remained private for long. Someone in the crowd of observers had undoubtedly captured video of the moment, and it would soon be analyzed and debated across television networks and internet forums. His small act of defiance would become much larger than he had anticipated. "I need to understand your reasoning, Captain," Harrison said, his tone becoming less formal and more personal. "We've known each other for 8 years. You've been one of my most reliable officers. Help me understand what happened out there." For the first time since entering the room, Marcus spoke. "Sir, I made a conscious decision based on my personal convictions. I take full responsibility for my actions and accept whatever consequences may follow." His voice was steady, showing no signs of regret or uncertainty. Harrison frowned. "That's not an explanation, Captain. That's a statement of fact. I need to know why you chose to break protocol during one of the most high-profile ceremonies of the year. The palace staff is in an uproar, and I have superiors demanding answers that I don't have." Marcus hesitated for a moment, then began to speak about his brother James. He told Harrison about the convoy attack, the investigation that followed, and the questions that had never been satisfactorily answered. He explained how he had learned about the intelligence warnings that were ignored, the mission that proceeded despite known risks, and the policies that seemed to prioritize political objectives over soldier safety. "My brother died following orders, sir," Marcus said. He trusted that his leaders would make decisions based on the best interests of the soldiers under their command. But what I learned afterward made me question whether that trust was justified. Harrison listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious as Marcus continued. Many career military officers had wrestled with similar doubts, especially after controversial conflicts that cost many lives. The balance between loyalty to the chain of command and personal moral convictions was a challenge that had no easy answers. "I understand your grief, Captain," Harrison said finally. "Losing a family member in service is something no one should have to endure. But taking that out on a visiting head of state during a ceremonial function isn't the appropriate response. There are proper channels for addressing concerns about military policy." Marcus shook his head slowly. "With respect, sir, I've tried those channels. I filed requests for information about my brother's mission. I spoke with his commanding officers. I reached out to military investigators. Every door was closed. Every inquiry was deflected. At some point, a soldier has to decide whether silent compliance is the same thing as complicity." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. A young aide entered and whispered something to Harrison, who nodded grimly. "The story has already hit social media," Harrison told Marcus after the aide left. "Video footage of the ceremony is being shared widely, and news outlets are trying to identify you." Marcus felt a knot form in his stomach. He had known there would be consequences for his actions, but he hadn't fully considered how quickly the story might spread or how much attention it might attract. What he had intended as a personal statement of conscience was becoming a public spectacle. "There's something else," Harrison continued. "I've been instructed to inform you that your security clearance is being suspended pending a full investigation. You're relieved of all duties effective immediately." He paused, clearly uncomfortable with delivering this news. "I'm sorry, Marcus. I know this isn't how you plan to end your career." The words hit Marcus harder than he had expected. Despite knowing that serious consequences were likely, hearing them spoken aloud made them feel suddenly real. His career in the Royal Guard was over, his reputation was in question, and his future was uncertain. All because he had chosen conscience over protocol in a single moment. "I understand, sir," Marcus replied, his voice remaining steady despite the turmoil he felt inside. "When would you like me to clear out my quarters?" "Take the rest of the week," Harrison said. "And Marcus, I'd strongly advise you to avoid speaking with any media outlets until this investigation is complete. Anything you say publicly will only make this situation more complicated." As Marcus stood to leave, Harrison spoke again. "For what it's worth, I respect the principles behind your decision, even if I disagree with how you expressed them. You're a good soldier who made a choice based on deeply held beliefs. History will have to judge whether it was the right choice." Walking back to his quarters, Marcus passed other guards who looked at him with expressions ranging from confusion to sympathy. Word of his situation had already spread through the ranks, and everyone seemed to have an opinion about what had happened. Some nodded respectfully as he passed, while others avoided eye contact entirely. In his room, Marcus sat on his bed and thought about calling his wife Sarah. She would need to know what had happened before she heard it from news reports. He also thought about his children and how they might react to seeing their father's name in headlines. This was not the legacy he had planned to leave behind. But as he reflected on the day's events, Marcus realized he felt no regret about his decision. He had acted according to his convictions, honoring the memory of his brother and the principles that had guided his entire life. Whatever consequences followed, he would face them with the same integrity that had defined his military service. By evening, Marcus's phone was ringing constantly. News organizations from around the world wanted to speak with the Royal Guard who had refused to salute President Trump. Sarah had already received calls at their home, and reporters were beginning to gather outside their front gate. The story that Marcus had hoped would remain a small personal statement had exploded into international news. "The children are worried," Sarah told him over the phone. "Emma saw the footage on the internet, and David heard about it from his colleagues at work. They want to know if you're in serious trouble." Her voice carried the concern of a military spouse who had supported her husband through many difficult situations, but nothing quite like this. Marcus sat in his quarters, looking out the window at the palace grounds where he had served for so many years. In just a few hours, his entire life had changed. The career he had built methodically over more than 2 decades was effectively over, and his future was filled with uncertainty. Yet he found himself remarkably calm about the situation. "Tell them I'm fine," Marcus said to his wife, "and tell them I did what I believed was right." Sometimes that's all a person can do. He could hear the television in the background at their home, probably showing news coverage of the day's events. Soon, his face and name would be known to millions of people who had never heard of him before. After hanging up with Sarah, Marcus turned on his small television to see how the story was being covered. The footage of the ceremony played repeatedly on news channels, with commentators analyzing every detail of his behavior. Some called his action disrespectful and inappropriate, while others praised him for taking a principled stand. Political experts debated what it meant for British-American relations, and military analysts discussed the traditions of ceremonial protocol. What struck Marcus most was how quickly the story had moved beyond the simple facts of what happened. Everyone seemed to have theories about his motivations, his political beliefs, and his character. Some reports described him as a hero standing up for his convictions, while others portrayed him as a rogue soldier who had violated his oath of service. None of them knew about James or the real reason behind his decision. A soft knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. Marcus opened it to find Sergeant Major Phillips, an old friend who had served alongside him for 15 years. Phillips entered without being invited, closing the door behind him and taking a seat across from Marcus. "Quite a day you've had," Phillips said with a slight smile. "The whole base is talking about nothing else. Some of the younger guards think you've gone completely mad, while others are calling you a legend." He paused, studying Marcus's face. "I'm guessing the truth is somewhere in between," Marcus appreciated having someone to talk with who understood military life and the complexities of serving in the Royal Guard. Phillips had always been a thoughtful soldier, the type who considered situations from multiple angles before forming opinions. If anyone could understand his decision, it would be Phillips. "I know you didn't do this lightly," Phillips continued. "In all the years we've served together, you've never been impulsive or reckless, so I'm assuming you had a damn good reason for what happened today." He waited for Marcus to respond, but when no explanation came, he tried a different approach. "Is this about your brother?" Phillips asked quietly. Marcus had never discussed the details of James's death with his colleagues, but everyone in the unit knew he had lost a sibling in Afghanistan. Military families understood the bonds between soldiers and the pain of losing someone in service. Marcus nodded slowly. "Among other things, yes. He told Phillips about the investigation into James's death, the unanswered questions, and his growing doubts about the leadership that had sent his brother into harm's way. He explained how these doubts had evolved into a deeper questioning of authority and the obligations that came with military service. Phillips listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly letting Marcus tell his story. When Marcus finished, Phillips was quiet for several minutes, clearly processing what he had heard. Finally, he spoke again. "I can't say I would have made the same choice," Phillips said carefully, "but I understand why you made it. The problem is that most people won't understand. They'll see a soldier who disrespected a visiting leader, not a brother who lost his sibling to questionable decision-making." This was exactly what Marcus had feared. His actions would be interpreted through the lens of current politics and international relations, rather than the personal principles that had motivated them. The nuanced reasons behind his decision would be lost in the oversimplified narratives that dominated public discourse. "There's something else you should know," Phillips said. "Word is that there will be a formal investigation into your conduct. They're bringing in investigators from outside the Guard to ensure objectivity. This could drag on for months, and they'll be looking into every aspect of your service record and personal life." Marcus had expected this, but hearing it confirmed made the situation feel more real. Military investigations were thorough and often intrusive, examining not just the specific incident in question, but the broader context of a soldier's life and career. Everything from his financial records to his personal relationships would be scrutinized for any factors that might have influenced his decision. They'll also be looking for political motivations, Phillips warned. "Any statements you've made about American foreign policy, any social media posts that could be interpreted as partisan, any associations with political groups. They'll want to determine whether this was a spontaneous decision based on personal grief or part of some larger political statement." This concerned Marcus more than the other aspects of the investigation. While he had indeed developed strong opinions about American military policy based on his research into James's death, he had always kept those opinions private. He had voted in elections and occasionally discussed current events with friends, but he had never been politically active or publicly partisan. His decision to refuse the salute was personal, not political. As the evening progressed, Marcus began to understand the full scope of what he had set in motion. News reports were now including analysis of his military record, background information about his family, and speculation about his future. Legal experts debated whether he could face criminal charges, while military historians discussed precedents for similar incidents. The most difficult part was watching how the story affected other people. His wife had to take time off work to deal with reporters outside their home. His children were fielding questions from friends and colleagues about their father's actions. Even his elderly parents, who lived in a small town outside London, were being contacted by journalists looking for insights into his character and upbringing. That night, as Marcus packed his personal belongings from his quarters, he reflected on the unexpected turn his life had taken. Just that morning, he had been a respected captain in the Royal Guard, looking forward to a quiet retirement ceremony in a few weeks. Now he was at the center of an international controversy, facing an uncertain future and possible legal consequences. Yet despite all the turmoil and uncertainty, Marcus felt a sense of peace about his decision. He had acted according to his conscience, honoring the memory of his brother and the principles that had guided his life. Whatever happened next, he would face it with the same integrity that had defined his military service. Some battles, he realized, were worth fighting regardless of the personal cost. 3 weeks after the incident, Marcus sat in a small conference room at military headquarters, facing a panel of 3 investigating officers. The formal investigation had been as thorough as Phillips had predicted, examining every aspect of his life and career with microscopic detail. Financial records, medical histories, personal correspondence, and testimony from colleagues had all been reviewed as investigators tried to understand his motivations. The lead investigator, Colonel Rebecca Matthews, was a career officer with a reputation for fairness and thoroughness. She had spent the past weeks interviewing everyone from Marcus's commanding officers to his childhood friends, building a comprehensive picture of the man who had made international headlines with a single gesture of defiance. "Captain Wellington," Colonel Matthews began, We've completed our investigation into the events of November 11th. Before we discuss our findings and recommendations, I want to give you an opportunity to make any additional statements or clarifications about your actions. Marcus had spent the 3 weeks thinking carefully about this moment. He had consulted with a military attorney, spoken extensively with his family, and reflected deeply on the choices that had led him here. His position remained unchanged from that first day. He had acted according to his conscience and accepted full responsibility for the consequences. "Colonel, I understand that my actions were a breach of protocol and contrary to military regulations," Marcus said. "I don't dispute the facts of what happened or attempt to excuse my behavior based on extenuating circumstances. I made a deliberate choice to refuse the customary salute, and I did so for personal reasons related to my convictions about leadership and accountability." Colonel Matthews nodded and referred to her notes. "During our investigation, we discovered the circumstances surrounding your brother's death in Afghanistan. We've reviewed the mission reports, intelligence assessments, and post-incident investigations. We understand that you believe negligent leadership contributed to that tragedy. This was the first time during the entire process that anyone in authority had acknowledged the legitimacy of Marcus's concerns about James's death. For months, he had felt like his questions and doubts were being dismissed or ignored. Hearing them stated plainly by the investigating officer was both validating and emotionally difficult. However, Colonel Matthews continued, we also found no evidence that your decision to refuse the salute was part of any coordinated political protest, or that you were influenced by outside groups or agitators. This appears to have been a personal decision based on your individual beliefs and experiences. The distinction was important. If the investigation had found evidence of political motivation or outside influence, Marcus could have faced much more serious charges related to sedition or insubordination. The fact that his actions were deemed personal rather than political would likely result in lesser consequences. Colonel Matthews looked at her fellow investigators before continuing. We also want to acknowledge that your service record prior to this incident was exemplary. Multiple witnesses testified to your professionalism, integrity, and dedication to duty. Your colleagues spoke of you with respect and admiration, and your commanding officers consistently rated your performance as outstanding. Marcus appreciated these words, but he knew they were likely a prelude to the formal findings and punishment that would follow. The investigation had been fair and thorough, but military discipline required consequences for violations of protocol, regardless of the underlying motivations. Our recommendation, Colonel Matthews said, is that you receive a formal reprimand for conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. This will be noted in your permanent record, but will not result in court-martial proceedings or criminal charges. Additionally, your early retirement will be processed immediately, with full benefits and honors. The decision was better than Marcus had feared, but also carried a note of finality that hit him harder than expected. His military career was officially over, ended not with the ceremony he had anticipated, but with a formal reprimand that would forever be associated with his service. Yet he was grateful that the investigators had recognized the complexity of his situation and chosen discipline rather than prosecution. "Thank you, Colonel," Marcus replied. "I accept the panel's findings and recommendations." After the formal proceedings ended, Colonel Matthews approached Marcus privately. "Off the record," she said quietly, "I want you to know that this was one of the most difficult cases I've ever investigated. Your service record speaks to your character and dedication, and the circumstances surrounding your brother's death would challenge anyone's faith in leadership." She paused, clearly choosing her words carefully. "While I can't condone your actions from a military discipline standpoint, I can understand them from a human perspective. Sometimes good soldiers find themselves in impossible situations where every choice carries a price." Marcus was moved by her words. Throughout the investigation, he had been treated fairly but formally, with little acknowledgement of the emotional and moral complexity of his situation. Colonel Matthews' personal comments reminded him that, behind the military structure and regulations, were human beings who could understand the difficult choices that service members sometimes faced. Walking out of headquarters for the last time, Marcus felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The uncertainty of the past 3 weeks was finally over, and he could begin moving forward with his life. But leaving the military after more than 2 decades was like losing a fundamental part of his identity. The structure, purpose, and camaraderie of military life had defined his adult existence. His phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. How did it go? She had been waiting anxiously for news about the investigation's outcome, knowing that their future depended on the panel's decision. Marcus typed back quickly, "It's over. Formal reprimand, but no criminal charges. Early retirement approved. Coming home?" The drive back to their house gave Marcus time to think about what came next. At 45, he was young enough to start a new career, but he had no clear idea what that might be. His skills were highly specialized for military service, and translating them to civilian employment would require careful thought and planning. More importantly, he needed to process the events of the past few weeks and their impact on his family. Emma and David had stood by him throughout the controversy, but he knew the situation had been difficult for them. Having a father at the center of international news attention was not something most people had to handle, and he was proud of how maturely they had responded. As he pulled into his driveway, Marcus saw Sarah waiting at the front door. Behind her, the house that had been their home for 8 years looked the same as always, but everything felt different. This was no longer the home of an active-duty Royal Guard captain. It was simply the home of Marcus Wellington, private citizen. That evening, as they sat together discussing the future, Sarah asked the question that had been on both their minds. "Do you regret what you did?" Marcus considered the question carefully. The past 3 weeks had cost him his career, subjected his family to intense scrutiny, and forced him to confront uncomfortable questions about loyalty, duty, and conscience. Yet when he thought about that moment on the red carpet, when President Trump had passed in front of him and he had kept his hand at his side, he felt the same sense of integrity and purpose that had motivated his decision. "No," he said finally, "I don't regret it. I wish the consequences had been less severe for all of us, but I don't regret the choice itself. Some things are more important than protocol or career advancement. Honor has to mean something." 6 months later, Marcus stood before a packed auditorium at Cambridge University, preparing to deliver a lecture he had never imagined giving. The invitation had come from the professor of military ethics, who had followed his story in the news and believed it offered valuable lessons for future military officers. The title of his talk was "Conscience and Command: When Duty Conflicts with Conviction." The transition to civilian life had been more challenging than Marcus had anticipated. After decades of structured military routine, the freedom to make his own schedule felt both liberating and overwhelming. He had turned down numerous lucrative offers from media companies and book publishers, preferring to take time to reflect on his experiences before sharing them publicly. The turning point had come when he received a letter from Sergeant Thompson, his brother James's friend who had survived the convoy attack. Thompson had seen news coverage of Marcus's story and wanted to share how much it meant to him. "Your brother would be proud," Thompson had written. "He always believed that soldiers should be guided by conscience as well as orders. What you did honored his memory and the memory of everyone who died that day." That letter had convinced Marcus to begin speaking publicly about his experience, not to relitigate political decisions or criticize specific leaders, but to explore the broader questions about moral courage and ethical leadership that his situation had raised. The Cambridge invitation was his third speaking engagement, following successful talks at a military academy and a veterans organization. Looking out at the audience of young officer candidates, Marcus saw faces that reminded him of his younger self and his brother James. These students were preparing for careers in military service, learning about strategy, tactics, and leadership, but Marcus wanted to talk to them about something that wasn't always covered in their textbooks: the moments when doing the right thing and following orders might not be the same thing. Candy 3. "Years ago," Marcus began, "I took an oath to serve with honor, integrity, and loyalty. I believed then and still believe now that these values are the foundation of military service. But what I learned through experience is that sometimes these values can come into conflict with each other. And when that happens, every soldier must decide which principle takes precedence." He told them about his career in the Royal Guard, about the pride he had taken in ceremonial duties and the respect he had felt for the traditions he upheld. He spoke about his brother James and the idealism that had driven both of them to military service. And he described the gradual process by which his faith in leadership had been shaken by the circumstances of James's death. "I want to be clear," Marcus said, "that I'm not advocating for disobedience or disrespect for authority. Military effectiveness depends on discipline and the chain of command. But I am suggesting that blind obedience, without regard for moral considerations, can lead to outcomes that dishonor the very values we swear to protect." The audience listened intently as Marcus described the events of November 11th and the decision that had changed his life. He was careful to emphasize that his choice was personal and specific to his circumstances, not a model that others should automatically follow. Every situation was different, and every soldier had to make their own decisions about how to balance competing obligations. During the question and answer period, a young woman in the front row raised her hand. "Captain Wellington, do you think you would make the same choice if you had to do it again?" she asked. Knowing what the consequences would be, Marcus had been asked variations of this question many times over the past months, and he had thought carefully about his answer. "I believe I would," he said. "The consequences were severe. I lost my career, subjected my family to public scrutiny, and created controversy that I never intended. But I also maintained my integrity and honored my conscience. In the end, those things matter more to me than personal comfort or professional advancement." Another student asked about the practical implications of his philosophy. "If every soldier makes individual decisions about which orders to follow, doesn't that undermine military effectiveness?" Marcus acknowledged this was a valid concern, but argued that moral reasoning and military discipline were not mutually exclusive. "The goal is not to create an army of individualists who follow their own whims," Marcus explained. "The goal is to develop leaders who can think critically about the ethical dimensions of their decisions and who have the courage to speak up when they see something wrong. Sometimes the greatest service a soldier can provide is to question decisions that put lives at unnecessary risk." After his talk, Marcus was approached by several students who wanted to continue the conversation privately. One young man, who introduced himself as Lieutenant Candidate Roberts, seemed particularly affected by the presentation. "My father is a career officer," Roberts said. "He's always taught me that loyalty to the chain of command is paramount. But your story makes me wonder about situations where that loyalty might be misplaced." Marcus spent 20 minutes talking with Roberts about the complexity of military ethics and the importance of developing personal principles that could guide decision-making in difficult situations. He emphasized that questioning authority was different from undermining it, and that the best military leaders were those who could balance obedience with moral reasoning. Driving home that evening, Marcus reflected on how much his life had changed since that morning at the palace. He was no longer Captain Marcus Wellington of the Royal Guard. He was simply Marcus Wellington, a man trying to make sense of his experiences and share what he had learned with others. The transition had been difficult, but he was beginning to see new possibilities for meaningful work and contribution. Sarah had been incredibly supportive throughout his transformation from military officer to public speaker and educator. "I think this is your real calling," she had told him after his first speaking engagement. "You spent 20 years following orders and serving the system. Now you can help others think more deeply about what service really means." Their children had also adapted well to the changes in their family's circumstances. Emma was proud to tell her friends about her father's principled stand, while David had written a paper about military ethics for his university philosophy class, using his father's experience as a case study. Both had come to understand that sometimes doing the right thing required personal sacrifice. As Marcus pulled into his driveway, he noticed a package waiting by the front door. Inside was a book about military ethics, along with a note from a professor at West Point who had heard his Cambridge lecture online. "Your story is exactly what our cadets need to hear," the note read. "Would you consider coming to speak to them?" Looking at the invitation, Marcus smiled. His career in the Royal Guard was over, but his service to military education was just beginning. Perhaps this was how he was meant to honor James's memory, not through a single moment of defiance, but through years of helping future leaders think more deeply about the moral dimensions of military service. That night, as he sat in his study writing notes for future presentations, Marcus thought about the letter from Sergeant Thompson that had started him on this new path. Thompson had been right. James would have been proud of the choice his older brother had made and the way he had used that choice to create something positive. The price of conscience had been high, But Marcus had discovered that integrity, once preserved, could become the foundation for a new kind of service. He was no longer a royal guard, but he was still a soldier in the ongoing battle for ethical leadership and moral courage. And that, he realized, was exactly where he belonged.